start to feel the stress myself, and I think it's always useful to kind of go back over a few skills and awarenesses that we can have to help us deal with some of the stress that just seems to be in the air this time of year during the holidays. So I'm just going to run over a few key points, and then we'll open it up, and we can talk about this topic or that people want to talk about. But the first thing that I think is just almost the most critical piece for managing holiday stress is just to stay balanced, and balanced in every way. I think it's a season when we can overindulge in food. People, if they're drinkers, overindulge in alcohol. I have no doubt people that use drugs overindulge in drugs too. But I think the whole season is one of excess with food and drink, and kind of that's in the air. There's this attitude, we'll do it with everything after the New Year. Let's party on now. The other thing too, excessive wise, I think is spending. And I think money and finances are something that a lot of addicts have issues with. And this is a time of year that really fuels excess in terms of finance as well, and spending, and creates a lot of worries for people, a lot of undue stress that can really be a problem. So one of the things I recommend that is just to always remember in this busy time, no matter how busy we are, and I had 2 back-to-back parties Saturday night, it was ridiculous, but to really take time for ourselves every day, to really find time, if you have the luxury of a nap, but certainly just have some quiet time, some downtime, put your phone on do not disturb, disconnect, or drop off the grid for a half hour, an hour, and just really give yourself that gift of time, because it really allows us to kind of regain our balance. And along with that goes sleep, plenty of sleep, allowing time to kind of regenerate. So in terms of that staying balanced piece too, I think one effective technique is to kind of anticipate what situations might cause you to be thrown off balance. And that may be a particularly stressful relationship in your family, and those are people you see during the holidays but not other times, so start to anticipate worry about that. It may be certain issues of family complications or financial problems or all kinds of issues. But I think really to kind of identify them in advance, make a plan, and incorporate your recovery friends and your support system in that. And that leads me to my second one, which is to really remain socially connected. I think this is a time when some of us, with all the holiday cheer, kind of want to just turn down the volume and withdraw and kind of disconnect and isolate some. So I think it's despite the ideal holiday season where we're all kind of out and festive, a lot of people don't feel that way. A lot of people are kind of withdrawing, and they're suffering with some loneliness and depression and some addictive behavior, or if not addictive impulses. So I think it's really important to ramp up your connection with your social group and your small family group, your friends, your close circle of friends. And that may mean reaching out to them too. I think sometimes we have the belief that people can read our minds, that we'd really like a call right now, but we don't do anything about it. And I think sometimes it takes us, we have to pick up the phone ourselves and initiate the call. People don't know that we're hurting or wanting to talk. So I think to really do that. And then also to just, if you happen to be the recipient of a call for support like that, to remember that you don't have to solve the problems. Oftentimes people just want to be heard. They want to be listened to, and just have a little empathy, I think is really sometimes the best we can do. And that's really all people want. Keep those social connections really rich and robust and very active. The third thing I would say is kind of managing expectations. And by that I mean any kind of addiction really thrives in open space, or space and time in which we are unaccountable and not there. And I think sometimes people, because it's uncomfortable, delay making plans for New Year's or for Christmas or other holiday gatherings during the season. And then all of a sudden they don't have plans. The day comes and they're kind of isolated and feeling bad and depressed. And also that's really the perfect opportunity to use or relapse. And I think it's really important to choreograph those big days. And if only just to say, okay, I'm going to spend it in a very quiet way with some people that I can share it with. I think it's a bad idea to be totally isolated in those days. But I would not walk into those days without a plan. Just like I wouldn't talk to a stimulant user, a meth user, a cocaine user, and say that we want to go into Friday night or Saturday night without a plan. Probably Friday nights would be a great night for a meeting. Saturday nights are great nights to have a plan as well. So it's a matter of anticipating. Anticipating some of those issues and then managing those time periods. The fourth thing is managing attitudes, and I think this has to do with kind of sometimes anticipating things from the past complications. We start to worry about stuff, and that self-talk in our head gets very negative, gets very chattery, gets very kind of destructive sometimes. And I think we really have to counter that and really take charge and take responsibility for our emotions and our feelings. As I say, the season just amplifies everything. And there's this, we are assaulted of these images of ideal families and ideal Christmas scenes and holiday scenes. And sometimes our lives don't match that. And it can be very jarring for people. So I think to really anticipate that, and really, if we have the experience of negative thoughts in our head or negative chatter, to really kind of counteract that with positive thoughts and with affirming thoughts. One technique I use personally for that is to just make a little gratitude list. And that simple act of stopping down and listing 5 things that I might be grateful for at that moment really is like it's an antitoxin to some of those negative thoughts. It kind of shifts me out of the mood, and it can really be quite effective. So there's simple things like that that can kind of counteract some of the negative weight of thoughts and feelings that can really kind of weigh us down in this time of year. And that's all kinds of little, whatever tricks you have for correcting those things. Maybe taking a walk, spending time with your pets, just taking a mindfulness break, cooking a good meal if you're a cook, playing piano, whatever it takes, whatever you like to do, whatever gives you pleasure. I think to really, in that sense, we should indulge ourselves, I think, in those things and our gifts and talents that we can enjoy, and not indulge in behaviors that have caused us problems in the past. And then the fifth thing and last thing I'll mention, in terms of just dealing overall with the holiday blues, is to really just kind of move out of yourself. And I think sometimes we can, and it's just human nature, but I think we can really get just far too wrapped up in ourselves and our issues and our problems. And our world gets small and very self-centered. I think we know that the holiday season across faith traditions is about giving and receiving and finding that balance, but it's really about getting out there. And I think it's a perfect time, maybe it's the easiest time of the year, to get out and do things that can get us out of ourselves. And by that I mean go work in a food dispensary for people, bring meals to people that don't have them on Thanksgiving, do something for someone else, sponsor a disadvantaged family, work for an organization for people in need. All those are actions that really not only get us in the mood of the season, but are really powerful in terms of helping us feel good about ourselves. It puts our own problems in balance. If at best it gives us kind of a respite from some of the stressors. So I think that's really important too. So just really it comes down to taking care of ourselves with not overeating, not over drinking, not overspending, getting lots of sleep, taking ourselves, our feelings, and really getting in, I think, the spirit with the strong social connections of being able to move out of ourselves and into the community and do what we can to make this a great holiday season for everybody. I think we have those special gifts and skills that can really make that happen. So that's kind of a quick summary on my part.
Thanks, David. You can type questions in the Q&A about anything. It can be about holiday stress, which is our topic today, but it can also be about anything that's going on with your addiction or your partner's addiction or just life in general. I wanted to, while people are formulating questions, David, I wanted to ask you, I hear a lot of people describe addiction as an intimacy disorder. They talk about how, as addicts, we struggle to connect with other people because, we learned in childhood, whatever, we were abused or neglected. We learned we couldn't trust other people. So we turned to an addictive substance or behavior because, that helped us escape our feelings. And that was certainly the case for me. And when I came into recovery, there weren't people in my life to reach out to. And the holidays really sort of emphasize that fact. Do you see people in early recovery sometimes struggling with sobriety because just because there's no one for them to connect to, and they know it's a season of connection, and et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of pressure for people to, and they imagine, I think everybody else is out there with tons of parties and all connected and having fun, and they're not. And I think the reality is that a lot of people come into program, especially early on, without those connections. But I think we have a ready-made family in the 12-step rooms that we attend. And that's certainly the case for me, and it was for probably the first couple of years of my own recovery. I was estranged from most of my family, and I was able to really celebrate with my 12-step family and my family of choice, as we say. So I think we have those opportunities there. I think sometimes the same mindset can interfere with our ability to reach out and do that. And I say that like it's something easy to do. I understand how complicated and hard it is to reach out sometimes too, because there's a lot of shame I think people carry. There's a lot of inhibition, a lot of self-doubt that they would be welcome or wanted sometimes, and that's that negative chatter I was talking about. So I think it's really important to connect with meetings. And I don't know, I know I got sober in New York many years ago, but we had things like this in New York. We have them here too, and there's big gatherings at people's houses that are kind of like almost a drop-in Christmas dinner. And one of them, and kind of one of the circles of my own recovery group, has gotten up to almost 100 people. They had 100 people at Thanksgiving. So it's like, to me, and my little taste of social anxiety, that's almost too much, right? It's like too big a crowd. But I think those opportunities are there. And in my experience, the 12-step groups and 12-step fellowships are always welcoming and understanding of that situation. So I think, yeah, definitely people are often missing their support systems, but I think we have a ready-made one in the 12-step fellowships that can help a lot.
Yeah, there's a meeting room here in Palm Springs where I live that on Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, the major holidays, they do round-the-clock meetings every hour, on the hour, interrupted only by a big dinner, usually at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, with turkey and stuffing and ham and everything. And anybody who doesn't have someplace to go can go there, and they get a couple of hundred people there for every holiday.
Right. We have the same thing at a couple 12-step clubhouses here do the same thing.
Yeah.
And sober dances on New Year's Eve. Almost everywhere you go, I think, these days, you can find a sober dance or two, which is fun too, to get out there. Because you don't have to overdrink and overindulge to enjoy New Year's Eve if you choose.
We're too old to dance in Palm Springs. This is God's waiting room, so.
Well, we kind of limp around here in Fort Lauderdale, but it's the spirit of the season, right? It's the idea.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's very helpful. Yeah.
So I encourage everybody to ask questions using the Q&A feature. I can sit here and ask David questions all day, but this session isn't for me, and it's really not for David. It's for the people in attendance. Do you find sex addicts in particular during the holidays want to? Well, let me phrase it this way. My last holiday in my addiction, I was living in Los Angeles. My sister was living in Orange County, about an hour away. My parents were in Indiana, but my sister had just had a baby. It was her first child, and maybe it was her second. I don't know. She had a baby. I think second child, baby and a toddler. And my parents came out to see the new baby. It was Christmas. I drove down to Orange County for Christmas Eve dinner and Christmas Eve church service, and all I could think about was leaving. I didn't want to, I just couldn't be there. And I did leave after midnight mass rather than spending the night at my sister's huge house with, 87 bedrooms. I drove back to LA and got high and cruised around looking for prostitutes all night. And apparently prostitutes have families because I couldn't find one, which in LA is bizarre. And then, so I did that all night. And then I went home and showered about 6 a.m. and drove back to Orange County for breakfast and spent Christmas Day with no sleep with my family. And there are pictures from that year. And in my eyes, I am so not present. I think more so than at any other time, the holidays made me want to check out,
Right.
even more so than usual. I mean, is that something people tend to experience?
I think so. I think there's this cultural event. I mean, it's in the air. It's on TV. It's really almost overwhelming sometimes with the expectation and the weight of the celebration of the season. And for most addicts who have probably some experience with trauma of one form or another, and some bad experiences and some strained family relationships, all those things kind of come together into one really heavy critical mass that kind of happens at this intersection of all those things that really can propel cravings for whatever the behavior is. And I think that's probably totally normal in terms of that wanting to check out. I think we do, if there's strained relationships, we make an effort, we go there, but it takes an incredible toll. And sometimes we can barely tolerate it for more than an hour or two, and we check out. And sometimes people check out on the site with drugs and alcohol. Sometimes they check out literally, physically. But I think that's a pretty common behavior because those feelings are so strong. And it's something I think normally addicts would escape from, but because of social pressure, we have to kind of sit there and hold them. And if we're not in recovery, if we don't have the skills to deal with them in a healthy way, it's really painful for people.
Looks like we've got a couple questions here. One of them says, any thoughts about how to enlarge my social support group if I'm new to recovery? My old gang were mostly all part of my addictive behaviors and we are no longer close. Where to start? ?
Well, I think in the fellowship is really the place to start. I think a lot of times with different kinds of addictive behaviors, it's almost like being a toddler sometimes, and I don't mean that in a minimizing way, but for me at least, social interactions was really, I had to kind of learn how to do them again in recovery. And it was very awkward, and I was very shy, and I was very inhibited, I had all this shame. So all these things kind of swirled around in a way that kind of made it really hard for me to kind of reach out. But I think the best way for me was to kind of push through that. And I found it helpful in the fellowship to take jobs. Like, I think it probably saved my life. I made coffee quite early on when I got into AA, and I had a job. That was it. So my job was the coffee. And if I happened to talk to people incidentally, that was great. And fast forward, I met a huge number of people, and it was a way to interact. So I think kind of putting yourself in a relatively safe situation like that, where you can interact with people, being a greeter at meetings, doing some kind of service, really kind of builds a built-in step to create that. The other thing that I didn't have the nerve to do for a while, and I cheated myself, was going out to fellowship after a meeting. I just could not wait to, it was like those cartoons where all you see is kind of smoke and a door open. I was gone. God forbid I should interact with anybody. But I think once I started doing that too, it just all became very natural. So I think pushing your comfort limits a little bit and engaging and finding ways to do it, I think that's the foundation for everything else. Absolutely. And I think the connection is really important.
Yeah, I would tack on to David's answer, attend regular meetings regularly, which means, go to the same meeting every week, at least 2 or 3 days a week. I mean, make sure you get to the same meeting every Tuesday or every Thursday and share. because then people will start to know you and they'll feel more comfortable around you. And you're at meetings to talk. Everybody's there, to share and to get sober. Let people in, and that's a way to let people in. You can crack the door open, and then people are much more willing to knock on it and say, "Hey, how you doing? We're going to coffee. Do you want to come?" And when they ask, go. So.
Yeah, that's a great thing, Scott. I had to learn how to say yes, automatically, because my default was no. Even if people did reach out, I would. But yeah, to really push through that.
I went to coffee with a lot of frogs, but I also went to coffee with some people that are still friends 20 years later.
Right.
So open yourself up. We got another question here. It says, David, you mentioned mindfulness. I don't know if this is too technical. I heard that mindful meditation has been attributed to creating new neural pathways in the brain that are linked to being more empathetic and less narcissistic, for lack of a better description. Is this true? And does what you meditate on matter in terms of the outcome?
Oh, that's a great question. And science is basically showing us that a regular mindfulness or meditation practice, and mindfulness really does the same result, will result in rewiring the brain to an extent where people do become much more open to a kind of a higher consciousness, and that includes empathy. There's a dramatic increase in the amount of empathy that people can feel, and it's a great way to restore empathy. I think I use that clinically for people that are both addicted to stimulants and for sex addicts. Both of them are very similar in how it affects the brain, but both of them are characterized by an increasing amount of objectification of people in their lives. And I think empathy is really the solution back out of that. And mindfulness is the technique with how we get there. So yeah, it's absolutely true. People become overall less self-centered. There's a sense of connection, and of connection physically, connection even psychically sometimes, and people can really kind of expand their minds by that. Now, in terms of what you meditate on, I believe that that really doesn't matter. I think what you want to do is keep it simple. Writing by just focusing on one's breath, or just counting. If you want, sometimes music, there's a rhythm. If you want music, sometimes that interferes with people. But I think for me, being mindful, being meditative is just really being in the present and noticing. And so I might follow my breath, but after a few counts, it really kind of fades and other stuff starts to bubble up. And people often think, God, I'm doing something wrong, when they have all these what we call monkey mind, right? The chatter in our brains. That's normal. That's normal for meditation. That in certain meditation circles, that's called purification. It's taking all that stuff and kind of releasing like bubbles working their way up and out of a body of water. And after a while, it calms down and it's clear. But I think sometimes in our busy lives, and I'll speak for myself, with phones and computers and emails and travel and calls, that stuff doesn't get processed until I actually sit down and have quiet space for 10 minutes, and then they start to kind of bubble up, but they do release, and then suddenly I'm in that calm moment that I'm wanting to go to. That's what, by the way, remember the first thing I talked about is really taking care of yourself and taking those time outs. That's the purpose of that. It's just to kind of let it bubble up and be gone. So I don't think it's important what you meditate. I think it's more about the process. And I think for me, it's the point of meditation is really not to meditate on anything, but really allow yourself to have some kind of physical start. And that's breath, usually for people, that just provides a rhythm that they can kind of fall into and let things happen. For a lot of stimulant addicts, a lot of sex addicts, mindfulness and meditation are really hard because there's a lot of body energy that's going on, and people are kind of often shaking their foot and kind of moving around a lot, and it's really hard to sit still. And so I would say if you're a beginner and you have that issue, if you can do it for 2 or 3 minutes, that's great. And then I would try to build up from there. So yeah, great question. And mindfulness and meditation are wonderful tools.
Is there a difference between mindfulness and meditation? And if so, what is it?
Okay, so meditation is more of a formal practice. There are many different styles of meditation that can start with a mantra or mudras, which are different hand gestures and different ways of doing it. The meditation courses I've taken often are very elaborate protocols for breathing, for positioning your tongue, for moving your eyes, and kind of a whole setup for the process. So that's a much more formal process that is kind of a sit down and do it in a formal way. For me, mindfulness is simply being in the moment, and I can be mindful while I'm doing anything. So one of my favorite things, in fact, is to take a short walk out in nature where I can see the sky and be mindful of the birds I hear, of the trees moving in the wind, or even a car going by, just kind of noticing. And mindfulness then is really sort of staying in the present tense and not kind of worrying about your shopping list or what you have to do next Tuesday, or worrying about what that jerk said to you, 4 days ago, but really kind of putting all that aside and staying in the moment and just noticing. You can be mindful while driving. I think we should be mindful, honestly, all the time, all of us. When I get distracted, when I get overloaded with too many projects or something, I really try to amp up my mindfulness, because those are the times I'll misplace my keys, or grab my glasses case and there's no glasses in it, or that kind of thing, where I'm kind of like scattered. That's where mindfulness is a really great technique to just kind of notice, okay, I'm putting my keys here, or I set my glasses there. And it works. It really is helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I have a friend who, when I get squirrely, he looks at me and says, "Where are your feet? Where are your feet?" and it makes me think, oh, I'm in a meeting, and I put my feet squarely on the floor and I pay attention. I become mindful. So yeah, cool. Another question here. The intimacy issue, could it be defined as an inability to form close relationships? I've often felt emotionally distant or cold. I've often thought it was from a lack of emotional bonding stemming from my immediate family. I'd like to learn more about this issue. I recently received Codependence, Rob's book. I have an issue of attracting toxic women in my life and feed off the chaos. Read the last chapter of that book. I am learning to identify my bottom line behaviors, and I'm trying to take the steps to get well. Is a good portion of this illness knowledge-based therapy, like learning about intimacy issues, etc. So kind of a question about intimacy issues and what are they, where do they come from, and how do we deal with them?
Wow, that's a great question, and a very informed question. This whole intimacy issue, to me, is really a formative issue that happens early on for most addicts. And I think most of us statistically have some kind of trauma, and that we think of trauma as sometimes, really major catastrophic events, an accident or an injury, or sexual abuse for sure. But I think other kinds of physical abuse, emotional abuse, intellectual abuse, where people discourage someone who may be an academic whiz, that their parents say, well, nobody goes to college in this family, that kind of thing. There's all kinds of ways it can happen. Bullying. So that traumatic experience, and most of us have more than one, really leads to these coping skills that are childlike. And sometimes the only thing that a child can do is withdraw or put up walls to protect him or herself. And that's their strategy to stay safe. Now, fast forward, as we're adults, we have a lot more skills, right? We have a fully developed brain, we have our voice, we have thoughts, we have our egos and our defenses. So we have a lot more tools in the toolkit. But when we get triggered sometimes with powerful old feelings, and any kind of intimacy really often trigger that, because it reminds us of other times we allowed people to get close, or people wanted to get close to us, and what happened. And I think so we kind of regress into these very old defense mechanisms that protect us. And they protected us before, they helped us survive, but they don't really help us thrive or be fully engaged in our lives now. And you talk about the impact it's having on your adult relationships. relationships. So I think these are things they stem from early life experiences. It's something that not only has to be learned, and I think there's some information that would be very useful. Some of Rob's books, there's some books out there on bonding and betrayal bonds and other kinds of things where we, as usually children, get involved, not through our own choice, in relationships that can be very abusive and teach us, and kind of that becomes the model that we carry forward into adulthood. So I think, yes, it is something that can be helped with knowledge, but I think that's only half the battle, at least in my work with intimacy and helping people restore some intimacy. It really has to also include feelings and emotions. I think defenses. I think oftentimes, in fact, the best way to access that is through our bodies and paying attention, because our brains are so smart as adults. We can kind of rationalize or talk ourselves out of things or talk ourselves away from things. But sometimes the feelings in our bodies don't lie. So if I have a knot in my stomach in a certain situation, like, what's that about? And an old Gestalt therapy technique would be like, okay, give that knot a voice. What is it saying to you? And just, we can kind of play that out in our heads and see what's my body communicating with me? What do I know about this? Because there's a certain muscle memory in terms of these interactions. When people get close, always send out energies that attract the wrong kind of people. And so all those dynamics are at play, and they're pre-conscious or subconscious, right? So it's like software in the background, and we're not even aware of it, but it's informing our choices. It's informing how we do things. It's impacting how we relate to people and who we kind of pull close into our lives and who we push away. So it's something that I think requires practice. It requires knowledge and information, but it also requires probably a good therapist to really walk you through some of the uncomfortable emotions and seeing and kind of put together those dots. And it's not, I don't think it has to be a kind of a Freudian 3 times a week for the rest of your life kind of thing. I think it can be with some good therapy and in not a long time, you can really start to connect the dots and see those patterns and make changes. Because it sounds like you've become aware of the repetitive patterns in your life. And when you take a step back and start to look at what role you played in that, what old emotions you brought to it, what old beliefs about yourself and other people you brought to it, that all that kind of stuff fits together into an experience that'll pull you out of that and help you make some change. So very exciting. And Rob's book is a great start for that, for sure.
I mean, my own experience with that, particularly attracting this certain type of person over and over and over and over. I grew up in a house that was very cold, but I had a mother who was not grounded in reality, B, highly narcissistic, and C, had really bad boundaries with me, her son. And I tend to attract people who have bad boundaries, and they get in, I let them in a little bit, and then everything starts to feel icky, just like my relationship with my mother would feel icky when I was a kid. I didn't know that anything was wrong. I just knew it felt icky. And I tend to attract people who make me feel icky. They glom on a little too much for me. And I mean, I'm sober in this program since 2002. I'm still working on it. So that's, but there is hope. I know people who work through these issues much more quickly than I do. So yeah, and I mentioned the final chapter of Rob's books. I think the chapter is called like Twos Don't Marry Eights or something. And he starts out talking about physical appearance. Twos and eights don't tend to partner up unless, there's some kind of imbalance like money and power, something like that. And the same can be said for emotional. If I'm an emotional 2 and I meet somebody who's really well balanced and super healthy and well adjusted, they're going to bore the shit out of me. And I'm going to scare them to death. We partner and we attract sometimes what we know, but what I've had to learn is I can set some boundaries around the craziness that I attract. What am I willing to put up with? What am I not willing to put up with? And is this somebody who is willing to grow and get healthier over time as I do the same? And it's a process. Yeah, very much.
I would add to that too. One of the mistakes people sometimes get into is they make it an all or nothing. So they have to kind of feel totally exposed to everybody and they're boundary crashing, or they feel totally cut off. And I think if we can bring it back and remember that we have these walls, but we can lower them a little bit. We don't have to lower them all the way down so we're exposed and vulnerable, but we have choices. We can let people in a little bit, and we can define our boundaries, not other people.
Yeah, boundaries are not about keeping other people out. They're about letting them safely in.
Exactly. Beautifully said.
So we've got a follow-up to that. The same individual, when looking for a therapist, he says he would prefer a therapist that holds to the Jungian school of thought rather than the Freudian model. If you wouldn't mind explaining the difference between the two, David, and then he asks any suggestions on finding a therapist.
Okay, wow, I love these. You never know where they're going to go. Yeah, I'd agree with you. Freudian model, Freudian, of course, is the classic psychoanalytic psychiatrist early on in the 1900s who his work is really an artifact of the times, believing a lot of stereotypes, basically, and sexual stereotypes, and everything going back to certain kinds of abusive behavior, formative behavior by the mother in particular, and a lot of pathology gets blamed on mothers and women and that construct. So I think it's dated. There are still some psychoanalysts around. Psychoanalysis requires 3 times a week for a long time. And it's basically the therapist does nothing except kind of listen and witness, and you just kind of free ramble talk. So I think given the busy time, it's maybe not the best kind of therapy. Jungian therapy grew out of Freudian therapy. Jungian I love because Jung not only got interested in recovery and 12-step programs, and he took Freud's a little bit further and got more mystical with it. He opened up the idea of collective unconscious, and just to me as a therapist and somebody who really likes this stuff, I'm all about Jung, just because he's more universal. Now, all that said, and I think Jung is terribly interesting, it's really hard to find even a strict Jungian therapist. So I want to share with you, I was just at a conference about the kind of latest studies on what kinds of therapies are most effective, psychotherapies. And basically the bottom line is that it don't really matter. It doesn't really matter. The study found that the therapeutic alliance, or the connection between the therapist and the client or patient, is the most important factor. And it doesn't really matter what kind of techniques, what kind of little magic the therapist introduces. It's really all about the give and take and the conversation. And I think oftentimes, at least with addicts when they're early on, just for me as a therapist, put my therapist hat on here, you kind of bear witness to people's experience, right? You sit there in a room, as we said earlier in this webinar, a lot of people don't have many people in their lives. There's not a lot of connection. Sometimes that therapist is really the only person that this person is talking to with any kind of real revealing of what's going on in their lives. So that connection is really important. And I think that kind of bears out my gut feeling. So when you're looking for a therapist, I don't know that a particular kind of therapy is the most important thing. I think with addiction recovery and codependence recovery, it's really important to have somebody that can do a number of different things, from traditional psychotherapy, what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, to motivational interviewing. Just you need somebody who's a little bit quick on their feet, who can kind of meet you where you're at and pull in different skills as they're required. So all that said, I would say it comes down to chemistry. If you like the person, if you feel comfortable with the person, that's a go. And therapeutic relationships are not marriages; they're commitments of sorts. But if it's not working out, it's okay to let it go. And I also think, and some therapists argue with this perhaps, but I also think it's okay to kind of interview a therapist, go in and see if there's chemistry. How are you going to find out if not? And if it's not, it's okay, So I think just go out there, be open, get a sense of the kind of person you would like. Now, there's styles. Some therapists are very directive, kind of in your face, confrontational. Other people are maybe more gentle or kind of lead you and support you as you kind of find your way. So there's different styles of therapy. But I think the act of going to therapy, of speaking with someone, of revealing someone, in and itself is healing in terms of intimacy, right? Because how intimate is that? That you're talking about these issues that you may not be speaking about with any other human being, but you're speaking about with this person, this therapist. And so, again, with my therapist hat on, it's a real privilege. It's an honor to be in that situation with people, to really hear about their inner lives, and there's a trust that goes with that. So that would go back as a client. Check your gut. Do you trust this person? Do you feel they get you? I think that's really important.
A lot of people that I talk to when they're therapist shopping have a list of questions. Are you more directive or less directive? Are you more focused on my behavior or my thinking, or both? Are you, familiar with the 12-step model? What is step one? When they say they're familiar with the 12-step model, say, oh, well, tell me what the first step is. Make sure. And you'll get a gut about, yeah, David nailed it. You're either going to like the therapist or not. You're going to have the therapeutic alliance, is the technical term, or not. And if you don't, you're not going to get very far, no matter what techniques or methodologies they're using. David, you mentioned CBT and some other things that are, sort of highly behaviorally directive and accountability-based therapies. That's primarily what's used with addicts, particularly early in the process. Do you find that, the deeper psychoanalytic issues, the trauma work and things like that, should that be done simultaneously or later after some sobriety is established and some ego strength and a support network is in place?
Right. So it is very important to kind of stage those things carefully. And I think really in the early part of recovery and treatment or therapy, if someone's new in recovery, if you think about some of the drama and chaos and disorganization that goes with a full-blown addiction, whether you're the acting out addict or the partner, there's a lot of chaos and drama that goes with that. And I think what people need at that moment is not, in fact, I don't think they're capable of really drilling down into some of their traumatic past, but really looking for skills to stabilize, to give them some structure in their lives, to help them kind of understand what are their triggers and cravings, what are some of their basic beliefs about addiction and recovery, and really give them skills to kind of stabilize, I guess I'd put it. If things are highly individual, that can take a few months or more. There's no fixed timetable for that. But I think as people gain strength, gain confidence, get their social networks kind of established, get their feet under them, then you do need to start dealing with some of these other issues, because I believe the source of addiction is a way for us to kind of self-medicate or avoid or escape or numb all this uncomfortable stuff that keeps popping up. And I think until that stuff ultimately is addressed properly, it's going to represent, if not an actual relapse, certainly triggers for cravings as those uncomfortable feelings come up. And those issues can be, for me, it was coming out as a gay man. All my addiction was all about checking out from that fear of what would happen and shame and other things. And people have their own issues and their own trauma to get past. But I think there is a time when that does become evident. When that does, I think there's some really, it's important to look for a therapist that is what we call trauma informed, which would mean that they have an understanding of trauma, they have an understanding of the role of trauma and addiction and some of the impact, and they have specific techniques to address that trauma. There's one that I'm certified in that's common, I think is very effective, called EMDR, which is eye movement and desensitization to reprocessing, which is a real mouthful. But it basically builds on how trauma affects the brain with unprocessed bits of memory that can't be filed in the hippocampus. And without getting into the weeds here, EMDR, by doing what's called bilateral stimulation, which can be done, originally it was done by moving your eyes to the left and right, back and forth. It can be done with clickers that vibrate in your left and right hands. It can be done with light bars, anything to kind of keep this going back and forth horizontally. It speeds up the connections between the two halves of the brain, and magically, and we don't quite know how, but it helps the brain process those trauma memories, so that what happens, and the goal of the therapy is to not lose the memory of it. You still remember it happening, but it doesn't have all the emotional baggage that it had originally, that those two things get separated out. So that kind of thing. EMDR, hypnotherapy can be useful for certain people. I think there's a number of different trauma-informed therapies that you want someone who's certified in whatever one appeals, and can be helpful. But I think in the course of recovery, if you're doing psychotherapy, I think there is a point at which trauma needs to be addressed and dealt with. But I think if you try to do it too soon, it's just too overpowering for the person. It takes time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's a window of tolerance when a client can handle, trauma work it's really painful. It's not fun. I mean, you kind of have to re-experience the trauma. And, that's the kind of thing that can send a newly sober addict right back into an active addict really, really quickly. David said a trauma-informed therapist. I would say a trauma-informed addiction therapist, because that's the kind of therapist who's going to have the best feel for when it's time to dig, as opposed to just focusing on, hey, let's stop the behaviors and build some better coping skills in the moment, which is a lot of what early addiction treatment's about.
I just saw a report, again, I was at a conference last week. There's a longitudinal study called ACEs, which is called the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. They followed people for over 20 years, thousands and thousands of people, and they measured their adverse childhood experiences, and that could be sexual abuse, physical abuse, bullying, having a parent who was mentally ill, having someone who was physically ill in the family, all these lists of things. And they found very definitively that the more of those things you have, the higher the risk you are, significantly higher, for mental health disorders, for addictions, substance use, and suicide, depression. But I mean, they've actually looked at how those kind of experiences result in a different brain than someone who doesn't go through trauma. The brains of adult trauma survivors are wired differently. And it's kind of a setup for addictive behavior. So I think recognizing the impact of trauma is critically important for people to heal. But it's all about the timing, because it can be just crushing if it's too soon. Because as Scott said, it's kind of you're dealing with something. It's like a live virus, right? You're going back and touching those memories, and kind of now you do it so the person isn't re-traumatized as a therapist, obviously, but it does bring up some of those feelings, and and that can be very triggering for people. So it's something that has to be done with great care and patience.
David, if you happen to have the name or the link of that study, would you send it to me? Because
yes.
I need to update my research base. There's an older study, and I forget who the authors were, but they looked at 4 or more incidents of significant trauma before the age of 18. And trauma is highly subjective between people, but usually we're talking about things like a mugging or sexual abuse or serious neglect or whatever. 4 or more instances of, and most people can qualify for that by the time they're 18, but
right.
Or a lot of people can. Most addicts certainly can, and that's what this study found. It was they were people who had that were like 3 times as likely to smoke, and they were like 5 times as likely to be depressed, and 7 times as likely to have anxiety, and 8 times as likely to be promiscuous or have an underage pregnancy, and they were, I think it was like 11.1 times as likely to become an IV drug user. trauma is not
Even lifespan. People live significantly shorter lives, 5, 7 years shorter. There's no specific cause of that, but just this general health impact.
Yeah. And there's a lot of research that does show when trauma is dealt with, the effects of it, abate. It's kind of like, you quit smoking and a couple years later, your lungs are cleared up, hopefully.
And with trauma therapy, this is what I like about the EMDR that I was describing. If you start to deal with one channel of trauma, the whole thing can kind of be healed very quickly. You don't have to deal with every single traumatic event. You deal with one pattern, and the whole thing kind of resolves in a really beautiful way. So, it's an amazing bit of work, but it's not something for the newly sober or the newly person in recovery. It's going to be very stressful.
We've got about 5 minutes left, everybody. We've got time for another question, although I don't have any. So if you've got a question, type it in real quick. We've taken David very off track from managing our holiday stress.
Right. I'd be curious if people have any techniques, just real quickly, to how they manage holiday stress. If they have a magic bullet that they... we have a quick question that just came in.
We do. Isn't there also some suggestion that previously traumatized people also seek out, to some degree, more trauma bonding, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's certainly true. There's a repetition phenomenon that happens with traumatic experience, where people do repeat it, and this is always not conscious. We find ourselves in the same kind of abusive relationships over and over again, or and other kinds of experiences where we repeat. And the theory of that is that people repeat it in order to find kind of a happy ending, to have an ending not traumatized. And that often doesn't work out well. But there is this impulse to kind of repeat what we know. And until we can get the insight and the emotional management to kind of do something different, chances are that stuff is going to repeat. Those choices, unconscious necessarily, but it does happen. It's a really great observation.
Yeah, that goes back to our question earlier, the issue of attracting the same type of toxic women and then feeding off the chaos. I think it's a very natural thing to do. In the chat, I was just asked if this video will be posted tomorrow on the site. Yeah, it takes me usually about half a day to get them up. So probably by tomorrow at noon, this video will be up on the site, and they're always accessible. And you can find them on YouTube if you want, but it's easier to find them on the site.
Great.
Any questions or suggestions on how people get through the holiday before we wrap it up?
No observation.
I have learned, for me, getting through the holidays, I host Thanksgiving pretty much every year, and I have 10 to 20 people here, and my place is. Have you been to my place, David?
No. Huh?
Oh, it's not big enough for 10 or 20 people.
Okay.
But we have a really good time, and it kind of makes me feel included, and it also makes me feel good to include other people. When I was new to recovery, and people would say, hey, we're having a party and there's going to be 200 people there or whatever, which freaks me out. It was suggested to me, find somebody who looks more uncomfortable than you feel and go talk to them and try to make them feel comfortable. And I do that, and it works. And that's kind of how I approach the holidays, is, try to help other people enjoy them. And I find that I enjoy them as part of it. And
it piggybacks on the comment just came in, volunteering, tell people even worse off than me. And that's one of those points I had in the middle, just get out of ourselves and reach out and help and be there for other people. Hugely important.
Yeah, it's like David said when he was new to recovery. taking a job, making coffee. It gives you a reason to be there and to feel good about being there because you're contributing somehow.
Right.
Yeah, cool.
Right. Right.
We got another suggestion here. I try to have time alone and give myself a timeout if I'm feeling overloaded.
Hugely important. And sometimes I think the holidays we feel pressure to push through, and that just really, we can crash and burn if we're not careful. So good for you for recognizing it and then acting on your own behalf. It's a great skill. Great skill.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, we are pretty well out of time. So thank you. David is scheduled for December 26th, and he has graciously agreed, despite the holiday, to come on and be with us. I'll be here with him, and we're looking forward to that. I think maybe one of the webinars on Monday is canceled because the guy's going to be out of town for the holidays. But that's it. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. David, thank you again so much. Give him another look at your book.
Oh yeah, okay. The book, one best nonfiction award a couple years ago, and it's making differences all over the world with stimulant problems. So
yeah, it's won a bunch of awards too. It's a great book. So yeah. Everybody, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you at our next session.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.